I'm not sure if I'm going to answer that particular point, but we'll see how we go. I'm also a graduate of UNE. I did Ag Ecos and was at Albies as well for my sins. Right. So yeah, as Alex said, Twiner, we were largest agricultural producers in Australia for many years. Basically got out of ag in any scale in about 4 years ago. Today still operate a couple of little farms at Marul, and we run an Angus and a composite stud with a focus on breeding for feed efficiency. So we are one of the few entities in the world that feed test male and female progeny. We've been doing it for 7 years, and yeah, we're trying to make some progress, but with anything genetics and living, it is somewhat complicated. There's a disclaimer, we're talking about a fund which I'll come back to. There's the history of Twine, which I've just, the past history, so a couple of other things. So talking about sustainability, I know JC's not a fan of that, but methane is obviously the elephant in the room for agriculture in cattle, livestock and sheep anyway. We funded CSIRO back in 2000 for a vaccine project. We put about $2 million into it back then. Unfortunately, it didn't have a productive outcome, so it folded. So been interested in methane emissions and sustainability of livestock production for over 20 years. Today, after our exit from agriculture, we do a bit of property development, but our real focus day to day is venture capital on decarbonisation. So we invest in seed to Series B stages of companies' growth. Generally it's hardware. We're anywhere around the world. We've been doing it off our private balance sheet up until about 6 months ago when we opened a fund for outside investors, and we just did our first soft close a couple of weeks ago, and we'll hopefully continue to grow, because this is, decarbonisation is a problem which is bigger than any one person's balance sheet or any one country's balance sheet, even if it's the US. Like the International Energy Agency calls it a $1.7 trillion a year problem. So that's how much money needs to be invested if we want to try and stay at 1.5 degrees C. So our investments in companies range from 100,000 US to 5 million. Hardware predominantly, very little software, occasionally a pseudo software thing. Food, agriculture, oceans, zero waste, clean energy, the built environment and zero carbon are our 6 verticals. We look for people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world, smart enough to work out how, and gutsy enough to do it. We also have another slogan that we stick by: you can't be green if you're in the red. So everything we look at has to be profitable, competitive in today's world, but hopefully with a big emphasis on doing it with less carbon emissions. There's a graph on the evolution of investment in the energy transition. Obviously energy is part of the carbon story, far from the only story. That hockey stick is only growing out the back end. Get onto agriculture, methane, whether we like it or not, whether you believe in the story of methane emissions from cattle is actually part of a cycle which actually has no any net emissions, or you don't. The reality is the world thinks otherwise, so it doesn't really matter what we think. We need to adjust to what the world, our customers, our consumers think of us. New Zealand's obviously front and centre in a lot of this, but you even see China doing things, and the Europeans particularly. Agriculture overall, it's a 40 billion tonne problem. 20 billion roughly, so half of it is cattle. That says cattle feedlot, but it's actually cattle overall. Compared to that, synthetic fertiliser, 3 billion, and soil emissions, 6.5 billion. So we're talking big numbers, It's 10% of the total global emissions. So if we could get rid of that enteric emissions, we get 5% of the global emissions straight off the top, which would do a hell of a lot for us in achieving sort of the goal of 1.5 degrees C. What do we think is going to happen in livestock, food, etc.? This is obviously our personal views. We're in it every day, hearing what people are doing, etc. On the left, you'll see plant-based proteins. V2 Food is one of the Australian big companies. You've heard Beyond Meat, etc. They're really struggling. Even in this world of the consumer, cost pressures, sustainable living, they're not going anywhere. Their market share is decreasing. Apart from the fundamental issue that everyone says, oh, if we all went plant-based, wouldn't it help the world? Well, reality is you can't produce enough pea for everyone to go and eat a plant-based diet. So it is actually a furphy. There's no way it could actually happen. Sure, you could have more people, a higher consumption of plant-based foods, but it can't feed the world. So I think we can forget about the plant-based. In the middle, you've got the cultured meats and synthetic. They're actually quite different. Cultured meats are also really struggling on a cost basis and scientific process basis. They may get there, but I think they're no closer than 10 years ago. It's a bit like some of the small nuclear modular reactors, which they say, oh, it's coming in 10 years. Well, they said that 20 years ago, and we'll see what happens. But maybe cultured meat gets there, somewhat dubious. The other one in there, though, is like the Every company, fermented proteins. That, I think, will play a bigger and bigger role in the food chain, and potentially the most competitive thing that livestock production will face going forward. With livestock ourselves, we've all heard about future feed, the Asparagopsis. So we at Twynham sent someone around the world for a 4-month tour trying to investigate Asparagopsis. Asparagopsis is the red seaweed, which produces predominantly bromoform, which is the inhibitor of methane emission or production and emissions, hence emissions. We came to the conclusion that we didn't think that was viable. We don't believe, no one's ever grown red seaweed in a commercial manner and cost effectively. The current efforts don't seem to be changing that outcome. You then have some alternative solutions, like you've got DSM with Bovair, you've got Ruminate with a synthetic bromoform. Hopefully they get closer to being cost effective. The biggest issue with any of this, as Josie and any producer in this room knows, like it's not as though we make a whole lot of money, especially this year compared to last year. So when people say, oh, it's a $100 a year solution, well, that's not actually a solution because no one can afford to do it. The consumers aren't going to pay any more. They're struggling to pay what they are paying today. So we need to come up with some much cheaper solutions. I said maybe Ruminate is one. There are a couple of others in that same field which are working on it. We have made an investment in one, and we have a couple of American visitors with us today inspecting the UNE facilities who are looking at probiotics and modifying how the rumen manages methanogens and hence the methane production, looking at a much lower cost of treatment and hopefully with some much better production gains as well, which theoretically all makes sense, but theory and practice, as we all know, in many things don't necessarily see eye to eye. From my perspective, that is what agriculture needs. Livestock production needs a solution to methane emissions. Without that, well, the world needs it because there aren't many gigaton solutions. There aren't many solutions that can take 5% of the world's CO2 emissions off the table in one foul swoop. You look at it, green cement, green steel, both of those have got a fair way to go. Everything else is like batteries and solar power, which rolling out and cost of making it, etc., are hard. We're seeing it, we're going to live it, we're going to be living it for the next 50 years, but they're parts of the solution, but some big ticket solutions are something like this. And they're the sorts of things that Twine Earth Fund looks to invest in and follow through. So my talk today got totally changed around when I actually read what I was meant to talk about today. I think what the consumer actually is willing to accept is something we have to all consider going forward. Today, with the cost of living crisis, the consumer's really not worrying about environment impacts, etc. They're more worried about keeping themselves alive and the rest of their lifestyle on the straight and narrow. But we'll get a time, and whether it's 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, when everyone's bouncing around and spending money out like it doesn't exist, and then they will revert to thinking about the environment and those other things, and that's when we need to have a better story and a better way of answering our critics. So be prepared. We've got a couple of years up our sleeve so far. I mean, ahead of us, I think, but we'll see. The industry's most at risk going forward in that social licence, as Josie would know, the Northern Australian industry faces a lot more problems. So to produce beef with less carbon intensity, you need quick turn off, you need every animal producing a kilo. So whether that's a young animal growing or a mother which has fallen pregnant straight after giving birth and is growing a calf in its belly, that's got to be happening constantly. And obviously fertility rates in the north of Australia are what kill it. Like if you're at 50% conception rates versus 85% in southern Australia, you're a long way behind the 8 ball in the carbon intensity world. So to beat emissions, obviously we've got the one-shot wonder. The other one that we've been concentrating on for quite a while is the genetics. So it's the genetics of feed efficiency, which is highly correlated to methane, because the more food you eat, pretty much more methane that's emitted. We think that's one of the tools in our toolbox as we go forward. Other things that in the management tool that we need to look at is fertility. So a lot of people in the north, and we see the big pastoral companies really working on that fertility aspect, getting rid of anything that's not being productive. Early maturity is also another big one, which I don't think anyone in the industry is really thinking about. Everyone's sort of thinking more high marbling numbers, bigger bullocks, makes it better for the abattoirs, etc. But on a carbon perspective, if you could if you could get an animal to marble at 18 months and be out the gate at 18 months and fat and happy, the industry would be a lot better off than hanging on to animals till they're 2.5 years of age. And then the real forgotten tool in our toolbox in certainly southern Australia, not so much in northern Australia, is crossbreeding. Like the Angus have really killed crossbreeding in southern Australia, and as a cattle industry, that's not a good thing for us, because crossbreeding has a hell of a lot of benefits for every producer. Weight gain, fertility, longevity, health, and so they're things, that's something which I think we can explore. And the other real thing there is quality of meat. So what's the consumer going to want going forward? We're seeing in Japan now that high marbled animal a lot of the consumers are going, well, I actually don't want to eat that regularly. So call that a marble score 10. A lot of them are now starting to say like marble score 5, 6s is what they want. In Australia, obviously that's even marble score 5 or 6 is a bloody high marble score. But what's the consumer going to be wanting in 10 years' time as a food, as overall food consumption? Hopefully we get away from so much processed food and everyone gets to do a bit more cooking at home, but what are those raw ingredients going to be? Is it going to be some ingredient which is a fermented protein that you get in some powder and you add some veggies, or is it going to be a nice hunk of cultured meat, or is it going to be a piece of meat from the north of Australia which is not particularly environmentally friendly, or is it going to be from Josie's farm up in the north which is amazingly environmentally friendly compared to all the rest because she's got all the ducks lined up and doing a wonderful management job? Or is it going to be something that people are going to want which has got a marble score 6 and that's generally going to be coming out of more southern areas? So they're questions which we'll just have to see how technology evolves and consumer preferences and how we tell our story. In reality is agriculture does a pretty bad job of telling its story to the average consumer. We've always been bad in this country. I'm not sure if we're going to do any better, but an ad like we just saw will possibly help. Looking at technologies that we think agriculture will head down the route of. So in the carbon emission space, obviously you've got the animal, you've also got how you manage your soils and your pastures. So I think the science is reasonably well agreed upon today that mixed species pastures are a good thing, and rotational grazing is also a good thing for soil. Some people argue, okay, it may not have such an impact on the actual animal weight gains, etc. But if you look on a per hectare weight gain, I think generally it's proving to be beneficial. The problem is who wants to go and move cattle every day, move fencing, etc. There are only a few committed crazies like ourselves who do that. So I think the whole virtual fencing will be a big game changer. It is legal in a few states of the country. It's still illegal in a couple, including New South Wales. My inside run on that is that should change by the middle of next year in New South Wales. Cost is still a big barrier. Still talking sort of $200, $250 a collar or a tag, and that's not viable for most producers. But with time and with everything we see in new technology, there'll be a curve, and as demand picks up and that price hopefully will drop. I guess what we do need to find is somebody who is willing to chase that volume at a lower price rather than try and get every last cent they can out of the early sales. So that's one area which we look at from a distance. And what else was there that I had here? And then robotics. So what's going to happen in our day-to-day roles on our farms? Like we're starting to see, we've got swarm farming out of Emerald, which have got the swarm tractor. I'm guessing most of you have seen a picture of it somewhere in the press or at a field day, and that they're an impressive piece of kit. And if you follow any of the sort of robotic newsletters in agriculture, every day or every week there's a new company coming out with a new piece of kit. Nearly all of them, though, are related to cropping. So the livestock world's a fair way behind, unless you're in the dairies. But I won't be surprised if we get better drones, and you can say, I want to muster that paddock and take them there, and if you're not on virtual fencing, you'll be sending a few drones out within 5 years, and they're going to be sort of your sheepdogs. You've also got we've all seen the Boston Robotics little dogs do backflips and all the rest of it. We'll see those, and tractors do certain job roles, which today we just go, well, how would they ever do it? But all that technology is going ahead in leaps and bounds. So what we do need are the smart younger people, because most of us older people aren't much good at that tech. So we do need the UNEs of this world to provide the training and the impetus and the desire of that joy of accomplishing things as we go forward. I think that's me. Any questions?